Good evening. Welcome to the monastery, to New Ostrog again. And I'm seated in a different part of the monastery than we filmed in last time. And here, surrounded by mallow, with full bloom right now. And the cliff behind me, I don't know if you can see any of it, but we'll film with the cliff as a background a little later, the big rock bluff. Tonight I just wanted to answer a question which has come up periodically. And this time I had about 3 people ask about it. One medical doctor from America wrote to me and said, as a medical doctor, of course, I know the truth of evolution, but I would like to hear an answer about how dinosaurs and other species that lived millions of years ago and millions of years before Adam and Eve, they had died. He said even the fruit in the Garden of Eden, when it was plucked from the tree and eaten, it would have died. So what is actually meant when we're talking about death coming to pass because of Adam and Eve's fall? You know, I think this is a question that probably needs to be dwelt on even more, and perhaps answered several times, because there's a peculiar twist away from the Orthodox Christian faith and how people particularly think about this. Somehow there seems to be the thought that man was created naturally immortal, and that everything was created naturally immortal. But if things were immortal by nature, then they would have to be gods, because only God can be immortal by nature. God is the only source of life. Every created thing is given life as a gift of grace. Mankind was not created immortal by nature, and he was not an immortal soul dwelling in a mortal, disposable unit called the body. Man was created a living soul, body and soul together. The soul is not naturally immortal. It's immortal by grace. It has the capacity to be immortal by grace. Man was created with mortality because he's not God. But he could have everlasting life through union with God. We call this theosis. Mankind was planted in the garden, was to grow up into the very same thing that we're striving to grow into, and that is theosis. That is to be participants in the energies of God and have, by grace, everlasting life. So when we talk about death entering at the fall of Adam and Eve, we're confusing something here. Adam and Eve were mortal. Death was a possibility for them. It was only by grace that they didn't die. So man, being the image and likeness of God, is intended to become immortal by grace. But he's still mortal. We're still created. We're not God. So we are not immortal by nature. Now, if you stop to think for a moment, man is created in the image and likeness of God. Nothing else is. Why then would we think that since man is mortal, why would we think that dinosaurs were immortal? Or apples, or pears, or peaches, or plums, or rabbits, or birds? Why would they be immortal? And why would they even be immortal by grace, since they're not this unique and special creation created in the image and likeness of God, with the will of God that they should attain theosis and be immortal through grace. So the whole idea that nothing could have died before Adam and Eve sinned is really almost a kind of as if we were deifying every living thing on the face of the earth. And really it's a kind of pantheism. The very idea that nothing else could have died before the sin of Adam and Eve is really a kind of pantheism. And we need to think seriously about this. Mankind, created in the image and likeness of God, was destined to immortality by grace. Nothing else was created in the image and likeness of God. Everything else was as mortal as man, but nothing else was intended to become immortal by grace through theosis. Apples, plums, peaches, blueberries cannot experience theosis. Dinosaurs and roadrunners and crocodiles and elephants, mammoths, none of these things are going to attain to theosis. They are not going to participate in the energies of God and be immortal. Mankind alone can receive this grace to become immortal. Now, in the Garden of Eden, mankind was completely under the grace of God, and he was growing up toward theosis in the Garden of Eden, having life as a gift of grace, but also having his humanity, his image and likeness of God, which was intended to be immortal by God's grace, by participation in his energies. Man was not immortal in the Garden of Eden. He is not God. He's created. Therefore, he's mortal. And the possibility of death is always there for every created thing. Only mankind could receive immortality through grace. And so when Adam and Eve fell in the Garden of Eden, it was death that came upon mankind, not upon all that exists. To suggest that everything else was immortal by nature is pantheism, because it means that everything else is a god. And even mankind, if he were immortal by nature, that would be a kind of pantheism, because it would mean that man is God and has a natural immortality, having been immortal and pre-existed all of creation. So we need to think very seriously about this argument about other creatures living before Adam and Eve and dying before Adam and Eve, because there's something very strange and very peculiar about this argument. Mankind alone fell out of his perfect communion with God, and he was mortal and death was his possibility. Being in perfect communion with God, he wouldn't die because he would be immortal by grace. But breaking his communion with God, no longer being in this perfect relationship of grace and in this synergy with God, then of course death was natural for him. He died because he broke communion with God. Dinosaurs were not in a grace-filled communion with God. There was no reason to suspect that they would not die before the fall of Adam and Eve. We're talking about humanity. We're talking about that person created in the image and likeness of God, for whom theosis is a possibility through our synergy with God's energies, and therefore immortal by grace. It's absolutely ridiculous and foolish for people to argue that there couldn't have been any creatures who died before Adam and Eve, because death hadn't entered the world yet. Death was in the world the day mankind was created, because mankind was mortal. But death was not his destiny, because of his perfect union with God and living in a perfect relationship with God's grace. Breaking that relationship caused him to die. He joined the rest of the animal world. That is why God clothed him in animal skins. It wasn't just that he inherited the usual animal passions, but that he also joined the rest of the animal world in death, in experiencing death. So that's really something that all of you need to think seriously about, especially those who are trying to argue that all animals, all fruits, all grains, all trees are immortal by nature, and that they died only because of Adam and Eve's fall. Because such an argument is pantheism. And we're talking about mankind, about Adam and Eve, about those into whom God had breathed a living soul. And so we need to really think and pray about that very seriously.